Thank you very much, Mr. President. I would like also to thank Professor Paun, Professor Sherman for the organization of this conference. So I will get straight to the point because we don't have too much time. My presentation is based on research that continues from my habilitation thesis, and it tries to identify the way populism plays a crucial role in nowadays. And I would like to start by saying that, unlike what is commonly believed, I think that populism is not such a huge threat that it is nowadays presented to be. And this is precisely because populists themselves had to accommodate a little bit to mainstream politics. And I will try to go into several steps. First, why are we interested today in populism? Because of a series of events happening around us, starting from the charismatic personalization of politics that we witness everywhere almost, going through electoralist anti-elitism and the fact that elections transform and retransform themselves into a series of referenda against the establishment, against what and who is in power, and against the principles of the organization of power itself, and a series of other evolutions, such as, for instance, the development of meetings and different kinds of civic movements with flash mobs, with other type of online and social media-based gatherings of protest and contestation that are new and put a serious threat and challenge to regular politics, classical politics, as party politics or as political politics as we thought it was up to this day. So the main structure of my presentation would be, I will try to define populism, but just in order to point out why do we need a definition of populism, and in the end, why do we need consideration of neo-populism in comparison with populism. Then I will try to problematize, with the help of three authors, Ernesto Laclau, Chantal Mouffe, and Jacques Rancière, populism as a constitutive and elementary form of radical politics. And then I will try to show that the development of populism into neo-populism is to a high extent an abdication from this constitutive radicalism. And for mainstream politics, and I would say for the European Union itself and for the way we organize through representative democracy, this is to some extent a chance, meaning that the failure of populism to develop into a huge radical contestation of the mainstream as it was in the past, meaning in a constitutivist way. So in order to get to the first part, I would just like to say that we have classical approaches of populism, and my colleagues who will continue today will go straight ahead into specificity of populism in Central and Eastern Europe as an attempt also to define elements of populism or to find characteristics of populism. The classical representation of populism by Ionescu and Gellner back in the end of the 60s, using the paraphrase from Marx, a ghost haunting the world, says a lot about the fact that populism was not defined and suffered from this lack of definition. Then a series of other authors like Margaret Canavan in the 80s tried to revive populism as a concept of political science and propose different kinds of approaches of populism. Later on, a series of other authors approached populism like Cas Mudde, for instance, or Yves Surel or others. And to end with this enumeration, I would like just to say that the only school of thought of populism with an identity as a school of thought of populism is the Latin American tradition through specifically the Argentinian sociologist and generally the Latin American analysts of this phenomena. because they made of populism one specific political phenomenon to that awakening of the Latin American continent. Maybe the most important trouble in defining populism was the one signaled by Benjamin Arditi, who wanted to use an expression of Deleuze and Guattari for 1,000 Plateaus, the concept of an exact concept. The fact that populism is not only an inexact concept, it doesn't lack exactitude, but it lacks it in such a way that it provokes everybody to consider themselves as being related to the need to define populism, to put something in the concept of populism. A void that is not really a void, but it's a void that we should fulfill with something. And trying to fill the void of the definition of populism is the huge challenge. Such a huge challenge that some political scientists, such as Pierre-André Taguieff, for instance, said that we should really drop any attempt to define populism. It's useless to try to define populism. Let's study it in practice in a very empirical way. And his famous formula is, let's study populism from Muammar al-Gaddafi to one French politician, Philippe de Villiers. So it's a huge gap of registers, a huge gap of attitudes, and of course of political frameworks where populism appears. Also, there were attempts of making out of populism a specific concept of Central and Eastern Europe after the fall of communism, and saying, for instance, like researchers such as Vladimir Tismaneanu, trying to show that post-communism is impregnated with populism, and because of that, there is a specificity of a rebirth of populism that is very Central and Eastern European. All in all, in the 90s, this definition of populism was increasingly vulgarized, and different approaches showed that in the end, it was not an element of the radical right wing, but also it could be very specific to the radical left wing. At the same time, it's not only related to identity aspects, and it could be also related to very social aspects. And with the fall of communism, that we should also try to see populism in the lack of the democratic practice, and not only in the democratic fatigue, in the too long period of elections and re-elections. I would disagree with Taguieff, saying that in the end we should define populism, at least for an operational purpose. And an operational purpose means that in the end we should use this concept in order to define concrete situations and to try to study them in practice. And so my idea of populism, I will only now read the definition and then explain it with the help of a short graphic picture. Populism is more than other things a discursive register with a hegemonic vocation. This hegemonic vocation is based on the exaltation of the popular identification, operated through the ideological articulation of the alleged characteristics of a collectivity, the people. And besides this articulation, we have an exclusion of the others seen as guilty precisely for the fact that the people is not fulfilled from the identity point of view, for the lack of fulfillment in identity terms of the people. So populism operates more or less like this. There is a frontier between the people and whatever, in a nebulous way, we can define as being the non-people. With the people, we do have the representatives of the people, the populists, leaders, parties, movements, or whatsoever, intellectuals. And on the other side, we do have, against the people, categories that are demonized, they are excluded from the mainstream discourse, and this range of categories could be very wide and to some extent contradictory. For instance, the rich for the populist left is with the non-people and against the people. But for instance, for the neoliberal radical populist discourse, the lazy are a part of this non-people that we have to eliminate through political combat. The main principle of functioning of populism is, in the end, this articulation of a series of demands that are sectoral, that are related to concrete issues, and within these populist rhetorics, they make a meaningful combination of words, of sentences, of ideas, of concepts, making a mass of demands that are presented to be articulated, naturally articulated. Whereas these demands are never naturally articulated, they are precisely articulated by the populist leaders in their attempt to convince us that this is a very natural representation of the political life. On one hand, the people, on the other hand, the non-people. The choice is no longer full of nuances. There is only one cut in the political life. Now, we have three authors, Laclau, Mouffe, and Rancière, trying to say that populism is a form of radical dissensus. It is based on the idea that politics is based on a contradictory way of seeing things, a common fight and permanent fight for power, based on the mechanism of exclusion and of creating contradictory camps within the political spectrum. And Laclau says from the very beginning that populism is the basis of populism is the basis of politics itself. It means that the constitution of the people is based on a contingent discursive act of collective representation, and this collective representation is made through naming. The unity of the social world is not really nameable, and this operation of naming the others, constructing the others, and creating in this way the idea that the others are against what we define as being us, meaning the people, is the basic principle of the functioning of populism. So naming the popular totality means creating what he calls a political excess that challenges the establishment. It means that by the margin of the populist discourse, we include those who are never included in the mainstream, and in this way we challenge the mainstream with this political excess. So there is no common measure between the populist and the establishment discourse. They are based on different kinds of logics, and in the end, either we represent the people in a radical way against the establishment, or there is no ground for political representation of the people. There is ground for the political representation of the partiality, for some parts of the society, but not for the people as a common actor of history. In the same vein, Chantal Mouffe says that agonism is the basis of political radicalism, and she opposes politics on one hand, based on order and administration, and the political space, the political itself, which is irreducible social antagonism, meaning that on one hand we do have administration and institutions, but they are not political. They are busy on subjecting us as citizens of politics. The only political space possible is a space of agonism. Agonism means that we should not think, as Laclau put it, in terms of inimicity, a permanent fight between the people and the non-people, but rather seeing the others as being adversary, trying to keep what separates us from the others, but at the same time creating a mass that is against an establishment that the popular forces oppose, more or less. And so there is multipolarity. Those who oppose the establishment keep their own identities, but also they have to create hegemonic combats against that establishment. And why is that? Because, as Mouffe put it, the people is divided per se, was always divided, and the history of administration and order and oppression is to divide permanently throughout the time the people. And so populism becomes something as a critical, important attempt to unify the people. It's something very rare in history. It's an occasion of the popular emancipation. In the end, Jacques Rancière says that democracy is at the basis of politics, he calls this not populism, not agonism, but democracy. And it is so because it's related to the very act of institutionalizing politics, both as a subject and as a mode of relating. This is because, I quote, there is an absence of a pre-given capacity to govern. Democracy is based on the very idea that we are all equal in terms of our capacity, potential capacity to govern. And there is no such thing as a particular class or part of the people that should govern instead or more than the others. The opposition of MOVE is related to the opposition of Rancière between politics, meaning the political of MOVE, everything that challenges the establishment. And on the other hand, Rancière is even more radical. He doesn't call it order or administration, but he calls it police. The police is actually veiling against the people, trying to surveil the people in such a way that the people cannot create a movement of emancipation. And this quote is quite relevant for the point of Rancière. The people is a supplementary part in relation to any counting of parts of the population that makes it possible to identify what he calls the part of those who have no part, le compte des incomptés, those who are not a part of the society, with the whole community. So the fact that we find elements within our society that are intentionally excluded by the mainstream, and we identify the entire society with their strike for emancipation, means that we make this chain of demands of the people against the establishment, or of politics against the police. And once again, like MOVE, populism, or politics if you wish, occurs as a provisional accident in the history of the forms of domination. History is a series of forms of domination, and politics occurs rarely as moments of identification with those who have no part in the usual state of affairs within society. The same thing goes with a right-wing thinker such as Chantal Del Sol. Anti-populism as a convenient closure of the political by the elites, the fact that the elites tried to block the access of those who try to represent the people to decision-making through this anti-populism, and populism is denounced as a concept that equals fascism and movements of regression. So what we get out of this radical analysis of populism is that, in the end, populism and politics are the same thing, more or less. There is a radical constitutive discourse and platform which is needed, and it is needed for two things. First, to provide a meaning for the collectivity, the people, because the people has no meaning, and this suits very well the elites. And then, the second step, it is to radically challenge the establishment or the order by posing this problem of the representation of those who have no part in society. Another question is our actual contemporary neo-populism. Is it still a form of radical dissensus? Does it match this criteria of radical dissensus as they were sketched by these authors and many others? And in order to answer to this question, I tried to make a comparison between classical forms of populism and the features of what we may call neo-populism. I sketched 8 criteria. I don't have the time to pass on each of these 8 criteria because of very clear reasons. I will just enumerate them and then discuss a little bit on the 3 in red that you have here on your screen. So, popular identity is the first criterion, and there is a formative attitude towards the people in classical populism and a patchwork of identities in the case of neo-populism. The second criterion is the populist perspective on the past, and in this case, populism tends to be much more passeistic than neo-populism, which is more oriented towards future action. Then, with respect to the mission, people's mission, populist mission is rather redemption. And there is a transcendentalist approach in classical populism. I will come back to that. And in the case of neo-populism, there is rather an accommodation with what happens in empirical terms. In terms of coherence, there is a much higher degree of coherence, of doctrinal entrenchment in the case of classical populism than in the case of neo-populism, that is heterogeneous and made of very many thematic aspects. Regarding people's relation with the leader, we jumped from admiration with no conditions and faithfulness towards what we may call conditioned loyalty, and the politician is no longer seen as a god, but rather as a common sense individual. Then, concerning the dominant way of communication, in the past we had direct but unidirectional relations of communication from the leader towards the people, and now we have bidirectional relations with chats and with discussions with participatory democracy whenever it happens with neo-populism. When the populists are in power, the dominant logic was rather consensualist in classical populism, and it is polemicist in the case of neo-populism. Populists leave out of the scandals and of the disruptions that they create nowadays in society. And in the end, populism as a classical type of discursive register was very persistent in temporal terms. It means that populist current was there for more than 50 years in some cases, with huge effects over the development of that society, whereas today there is more like a temporal precariousness. So very quickly I will go just into 3 of these 8 criteria, starting with the popular identity. Well, classical populism has a defining feature, which is constitutivism. It's based on the idea that the people, as all the individuals capable to vote according to the law, are shaped at the same time as a political subject, as it is shaped the ideology itself. So populism and the creation of electoral, political, modern nation are more or less concomitant. This happened back in the 19th century under Louis Napoleon Bonaparte in France, the future Emperor Napoleon III. It happens today, or it happened a few years ago with Evo Morales in Bolivia, or with Rafael Correa in Ecuador. It means that parts of the political body were never politically active, and they become politically active in a constitutivist form when populism appears as an ideology. Now, in neo-populism, what we do have, it's rather a patchwork. There is no more idea of the constitution of the people, of course, because the people is constituted already. It is impossible to redefine the people in radical political terms. And so you have to build something like a patchwork to cope with the elements that are already there. And I think that the best example is Silvio Berlusconi in Italy, who was a populist leader, able to work at the same time as a modernizer, but also as a politician who respected the past, at the same time trying to work with different kinds of identities in order to become dominant in elections. On the second out of the 8 criteria, the mission, classical populism was based on the transcendental dimension. The fact that classical populists wanted to change the world, to lead the masses beyond what they have been before this populist action, to transform society. And this happened through saving acts, to some sort of a civil religion. This is, for instance, the action of Jorge Gaetan in Colombia in the 1940s, who promised really popular redemption and he's considered to be even nowadays a hero because he was murdered, but also because of the fact that these promises of redemption, of passing away from one kind of society to another one, were seen as being achievable, but not achieved because of the plots of the elites against Gaitan. So there is a transcendental dimension, and there is a will to go beyond what they were before. Now, in the case of Neo-Populism, there is rather critical absence of redemption, discourses of redemption. In the end, promises are much more mundane. They would like to clean the political world, to reduce fees and taxes, to strengthen the citizens' power through referendum, to take the corrupts to people's courts and so on and so forth. So a lot of, let's say, types of measures that are very particular and that are susceptible to make them win elections. But there is no such idea of great transgression. There is no such thing as a idea of collective redemption that would create a new nation or a new people. And in terms of coherence, in the end, I have to say that classical populism was very essentialist and was very dogmatic. It was based on two kinds of trends. Rather traditional and religious values for the right, family, the church, the nation, or progressivist, classist of values in the case of the left. The working classes, internationalism, few central themes, and one coherent idea about society. We are there and we are politicians because we need to represent the people, and we have this list of ideas for the collective salvation of that people. For instance, Perón was one of the champions of such demarche. And in the case of neo-populism, I would say that adaptation is the main principle. So they adapt to what happens on the ground. They have very few unshakable referential terms, and because of that, they are able to create and recreate kinds of political discourses in order to get as many votes as possible without being concerned with the coherence imperative. So to end with, I would say that this development or regression from classical populism to neo-populism is to a high extent a process of depoliticization. It means that the radical alternative is abandoned or is partially abandoned. There is a continuous adaptation to the conditions established by the mainstream political framework, and a domestication of the demands and of the modes of actions. No more insurrection, no more radical demands. If you take the demands of the populists, very few of them ask for instance, for the disruption of the European Union itself. Even some of the far right or far left wouldn't dare to call for the end, the real end of the European Union. Because of that, I would say that we can qualify the situation as being a consensual disagreement. It means that whatever are these movements within the real mainstream political world, there is a consensus that the modes of action and what is reasonable to demand for a political system remains the same as it is happening in the actual political framework, which contrasts with classical populism, where the main demand was to change almost everything and in a very quick way. Thank you. I abused my time. Thank you.